The transition from the street where the butcher lives to an official government-sanctioned name marks the beginning of the struggle between the people and the state. While the commoners wanted names that helped them find their way, the ruling class wanted names that shouted their glory. This tension would eventually lead to the rigid grids and numbered avenues we see today. But in this early stage, the street was a living, breathing reflection of the community's daily grind. It was a world of sensory landmarks, where the name of the road was as real and raw as the cobblestones beneath your feet. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance and the rise of powerful absolute monarchs, the organic era of street naming faced its first major threat. Kings, queens, and emperors across Europe began to realize that the streets were more than just paths for commerce. They were a canvas for propaganda. The shift from descriptive names like Old Market Street to honorific names like King Charles Street marked a pivotal moment in human history. It was the moment the state took ownership of the map. In the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly in cities like London and Paris, the ruling elite began to replace the blunt, often vulgar names of the past with titles that projected stability and loyalty. If a monarch wanted to consolidate power, they didn't just build a palace. They ensured that every time a citizen gave their address, they were inadvertently paying homage to the crown. This was the birth of the ego map. In Paris, King Henry IV and later Louis XIV used urban planning as a weapon. They cleared out the tangled, nameless slums and replaced them with grand, symmetrical squares and boulevards. These new streets weren't named after the people who lived on them or the trades practiced there. Instead, they were named after members of the royal family, military victories, or saints. This created a psychological shift in the population. To live on Rue Royale was to live under the direct gaze and protection of the king. The street name became a status symbol. For the first time, an address could indicate your social standing. If you lived on a street named after a duke, you were someone. If you lived on Mud Lane, you were nobody. This era also saw the rise of the developer's ego. As cities expanded beyond their ancient walls, wealthy landowners began to develop private estates. In London, the Earl of Bedford or the Duke of Westminster didn't just build houses. They named the surrounding streets after their family titles and ancestral homes. This is why, even today, central London is a maze of names like Grosvenor, Berkeley, and Cavendish. It wasn't about navigation, it was about branding. They were marking their territory, ensuring that their family legacy would be etched into the very dirt of the city for centuries. However, this top-down naming process met with significant resistance from the common people. The residents of these cities often ignored the new, fancy names. In the back alleys, people continued to use the old descriptive titles. This created a dual map reality, where the official government records showed one name, but the people living there used another. To bridge this gap, authorities began to do something revolutionary. They started putting up physical signs. The first street signs were often made of stone or wood, bolted to the corners of buildings. This was the government's way of saying, this is what this place is called, whether you like it or not. It was an act of linguistic colonization. By the time the British and French began to cross the Atlantic to the New World, they brought this philosophy with them. They weren't just bringing people, they were bringing a system of naming that favored the powerful over the practical. The stage was set for the American colonies, where street naming would take an even more radical and eventually more mathematical turn.
As the 17th century drew to a close, the focus of street naming shifted across the Atlantic to the New World. While European cities were tangled knots of ancient alleys and royal ego, the American colonies offered a blank slate. The man who would fundamentally change the way we think about city navigation was William Penn, the founder of Philadelphia. Penn wasn't just a developer, He was a Quaker with a radical vision of social equality and religious tolerance. He looked at the chaos of London, the city he had fled, and decided that Philadelphia would be different. In 1682, Penn designed a city plan that rejected the European tradition of naming streets after kings and noblemen. To Penn, naming a street after a person was an act of vanity that bordered on sin. He wanted a city that felt orderly, predictable, and, most importantly, humble. His solution was the grid. By laying out streets in straight lines that intersected at right angles, he created a system where anyone, regardless of their status or education, could find their way. To name these streets, Penn turned to nature. Instead of King Street or Queen Street, he chose the names of local trees: chestnut, walnut, locust, spruce, and pine. This was a revolutionary act of branding. It sent a message that Philadelphia belonged to the land and the people, not to a distant monarch. These botanical streets ran east-west, creating a sense of calm and continuity. But Penn didn't stop there. For the streets running north-south, he implemented a system that would become the hallmark of American urbanism: numbers. Starting from the Delaware River, he simply called them First Street, Second Street, Third Street, and so on. This was the birth of the numerical system. It stripped away the poetry and the politics of naming and replaced them with pure, cold logic. You didn't need to know the history of a duke to find your destination. You just needed to know how to count. This shift was more than just a convenience. It was a democratic tool. In a city where immigrants from all over the world were arriving, numbers provided a universal language. You didn't need to speak English to understand that 4th Street came after 3rd Street. Penn's grid and numbering system were designed to facilitate trade and movement, making the city a machine for growth. However, Philadelphia's success created a new kind of tension. While the grid was efficient, it was also criticized for being soulless. Critics argued that by removing names, Penn had removed the story of the city. Yet, the efficiency of the Philadelphia model was undeniable. As other American cities began to spring up, they looked to Penn's grid as the gold standard. The battle between names and numbers had begun, a battle that would define the character of every major American city, from New York to San Francisco. Penn had succeeded in killing the ego map, but in doing so, he had invited a new era of mathematical precision that would eventually lead to the most famous street naming project in history, the Commissioner's Plan of New York. By the turn of the 19th century, New York City, specifically the island of Manhattan, was a disaster. Below Houston Street, the city was a chaotic mess of colonial lanes, cow paths, and Dutch-inspired alleyways that twisted and turned with no rhyme or reason. It was picturesque, but for a growing global powerhouse, it was a nightmare. In 1811, the city government decided to do something so bold, so arrogant, and so ruthlessly efficient that it would change the face of urban planning forever. They commissioned the Commissioner's Plan. The goal was simple: organize the wild, hilly landscape of Manhattan into a predictable, sellable, and navigable grid. The men behind the plan, Simeon DeWitt, Gouverneur Morris, and John Rutherford, were not poets or historians. They were pragmatists. They looked at the winding, organic streets of old London and Paris and saw only insalubrity and wasted space. They wanted a city that worked like a factory. The result was the famous Manhattan Grid: 12 north-south avenues and 155 east-west streets. But the most controversial part wasn't the layout, it was the naming. The commissioners decided to strip away almost all descriptive names. They ignored the names of local landowners, heroes of the Revolution, and even the local topography. In their place, they put a cold, relentless sequence of numbers. This was a radical departure from the king's signature style of naming. In New York,
42nd Street didn't care who you were or how much money you had. It was just a coordinate. This mathematical naming was the ultimate expression of the American spirit of the time, equality through anonymity. The grid treated every block as equal, every lot as a commodity to be bought and sold. It was the democratization of the map. However, the plan faced fierce backlash. New Yorkers of the 1800s complained that the grid was monotonous and ugly. They lamented the loss of the beautiful winding Greenwich Lane or Art Street. One famous critic called it a graveyard of the imagination. But the government stood firm. They realized that in a city of immigrants and rapid commerce, a numbered system was the only way to ensure that a person arriving from Ireland, Italy, or Germany could find their way without a translator. There was one major exception to this rigid rule: Broadway. Broadway was an old Native American trail that refused to be tamed by the grid. It sliced diagonally across the perfect rectangles, creating irregular, triangular spaces like Times Square and Union Square. These accidents in the grid became the most vibrant, iconic parts of the city. The Manhattan 1811 plan proved that street naming was no longer about honor, it was about scalability. As the United States began its westward expansion, the numbered grid became the blueprint for the American dream. From Chicago to Salt Lake City, the lesson was clear. If you want a city to grow at the speed of light, you have to stop naming your streets after people and start naming them after math.
As the 19th century progressed, the United States turned its eyes toward the vast, untamed western frontier. This era, fueled by the ideology of manifest destiny, required more than just explorers and wagons. It required a system of organization that could be deployed rapidly across thousands of miles. The Philadelphia model and the Manhattan grid weren't just city plans anymore. They became the DNA of the American West. As pioneers moved across the plains, they brought a standardized naming philosophy that turned the chaotic wilderness into a series of predictable, marketable towns. When a new town was founded along the expanding railroad lines, the process was almost industrial. A land surveyor would arrive, lay down a grid of stakes, and assign names before a single permanent building was even erected. This instant city approach relied on a specific hierarchy of naming. Typically, the street running parallel to the railroad tracks became Front Street or Main Street, the commercial heart of the town. From there, the grid expanded using the proven formula: numbers in one direction and trees or American heroes in the other. This was the era where Main Street, USA became a cultural phenomenon. By naming the central thoroughfare Main, developers created an immediate sense of familiarity for settlers coming from the east. It didn't matter if you were in Kansas, Nebraska, or Colorado. You knew that Main Street was where you'd find the bank, the general store, and the saloon. This wasn't just about navigation, it was about psychological comfort. In an unpredictable and often hostile environment, the rigid, numbered grid offered a sense of civilized order. However, the westward expansion also introduced a new layer to the naming game: the pioneer ego. While the grid was the standard, the men who owned the land, the railroad tycoons and the land speculators, often couldn't resist the urge to immortalize themselves. In many Western towns, you'll find the numbered grid interrupted by streets named after the wives, daughters, or business partners of the town's founder. These names served as branding for the specific developments, a practice that would later evolve into the modern suburban naming conventions we see today. Crucially, this period saw the birth of the street versus avenue distinction as a formal rule. In many Western cities, streets were designated to run east-west, while avenues ran north-south. This helped people orient themselves in flat landscapes where there were few natural landmarks like hills or rivers to guide them. By the mid-1800s, the American street naming system had become a language of its own, a shorthand for progress and a tool for turning the Wild West into a series of neatly packaged real estate opportunities. But as these towns grew into massive metropolises, the simplicity of the grid began to clash with the growing complexity of the mail. With thousands of main streets and second streets appearing across the country, the burgeoning United States Post Office was about to face its greatest challenge. How do you deliver a letter when every town in the country has the exact same map?
By the late 19th century, the United States was no longer a collection of isolated frontier towns. It was a connected nation. The railroad and the telegraph had shrunk the distance between New York and San Francisco, but the mail system was buckling under the weight of its own success. This period marked the Great Standardization, a time when street naming shifted from being a local choice to a federal necessity. The culprit? The United States Post Office Department. As the volume of mail exploded, the lack of unique street names became a logistical nightmare. In a single county, there might be 10 different Washington streets or 5 Main streets. For a local resident, this wasn't a problem, but for a postal clerk sorting thousands of letters, it was a recipe for disaster. The government realized that if the economy was to function, the map had to be cleaned up. This led to the widespread adoption of the duplication rule, the systematic renaming of streets to ensure no two roads in the same vicinity shared a name. This era saw the forced renaming of thousands of American streets. Historic, descriptive names that had existed for generations were wiped off the map in favor of more distinct, often blander titles. In many cities, the post office pressured local councils to adopt phonetic alphabet naming or to strictly follow the street versus avenue rule. If a town had 2 Oak Streets, one had to go. This was the first time that the efficiency of the state took precedence over the memory of the people. To solve the navigation crisis, the post office also pushed for the universal adoption of house numbering. Before this, many houses didn't have numbers at all. You simply lived next to the blacksmith or 3 doors down from the church. The government introduced the Philadelphia system of house numbering nationwide, where numbers were assigned based on the block. For example, all houses on the block between 4th and 5th Streets would be in the 400s. This made every house in America a coordinate on a giant national grid. However, this standardization met with unexpected cultural resistance. In the South, particularly in cities like Charleston and New Orleans, residents fought to keep their French and Spanish street names, seeing the new numerical and standardized systems as an invasion of their heritage. They argued that a street name was a story, not just a data point for a mailman. Despite the pushback, the logic of the machine won. By the 1920s, the American street naming system had become one of the most organized and efficient in the world. But just as the post office was bringing order to the chaos, a new invention was about to tear the grid apart. The rise of the automobile was coming, and with it, the birth of the suburban labyrinth. The straight lines of the 19th century were about to be replaced by the curves, cul-de-sacs, and whimsical names of the modern American suburb, where naming would move from the realm of the government back into the hands of the marketers. After World War II, the American landscape underwent its most dramatic transformation since the invention of the grid. As soldiers returned home and the baby boom began, the straight, rigid lines of the 19th century city started to feel like a cage. People wanted space, air, and a sense of country living, even if they were only 20 miles from downtown. This gave birth to the modern American suburb, and with it, a radical new philosophy in street naming, the romantic labyrinth. Developers like William Levitt, the man behind the famous Levittowns, realized that the numbered grid was associated with the grit and noise of the industrial city. To sell the suburban dream, they had to change the language of the map. They moved away from 14th Street and Main Street and toward names that evoked a sense of peace, nature, and social status. This was the era of the pleasant name. Suddenly, every new development was filled with meadow lanes, whispering pines, and pleasant views, even if there wasn't a meadow or a pine tree in sight. The physical layout of the streets changed too. Influenced by the Garden City movement, planners began to intentionally break the grid. They designed winding roads, loops, and the iconic cul-de-sac. The goal was to keep through traffic out and create a private, quiet sanctuary for families. But this new geometry required a new vocabulary. The simple street and avenue labels weren't enough. This era saw the explosion of suffixes: drive, court, way, circle, terrace, and place. These weren't just descriptors, they were marketing tiers. A court or a circle implied a sense of community and safety because the road ended in a dead end where children could play. However, this move toward marketing-based naming created a massive navigation problem. While the 1811 Manhattan grid was easy to memorize, the suburban labyrinth was designed to be confusing to outsiders. If you didn't live there, you were likely to get lost in a sea of oak-themed names. A single neighborhood might have an Oak Street, Oak Drive, Oak Court, and Oak Lane, all intersecting each other. This wasn't an accident. It was a form of exclusionary design. It signaled that this space was for the residents, not for the general public. This period also marked the moment when street naming became a primary tool for real estate value. Developers discovered that a house on a boulevard or a drive could be priced higher than a house on a street. The name of the road became a brand. As the automobile became the primary mode of transport, the street name was no longer a tool for a person walking to the market. It was a line of text on a glossy brochure meant to lure families away from the city. But as the suburbs sprawled further into the horizon, the names began to lose their connection to reality entirely. The age of irony in street naming was beginning, where streets were named after the very things that were destroyed to build them. Orchard Way was built over a bulldozed apple grove. Deer Run was built where the wildlife had been chased away. The American street map was becoming a beautiful fiction, hiding the industrial efficiency that made the suburbs possible.
While the suburbs were busy naming streets after trees and quiet dreams, a much louder movement was taking place in the heart of America's cities. By the 1960s and 70s, the map of the United States began to reflect a massive social upheaval. Street naming shifted from a tool of the developer or the monarch into a tool of the activist. For marginalized communities, the power to name a street was the power to claim space and demand respect in a country that had long ignored them. The most significant example of this is the Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard phenomenon. Following the assassination of Dr. King in 1968, Black communities across the nation petitioned local governments to rename major thoroughfares in his honor. This wasn't just about a sign, it was about transforming the geography of white supremacy. In many southern cities, renaming a street that was previously named after a Confederate general or a slaveholder into MLK Boulevard was a radical act of reclamation. It forced the city to literally change its identity. However, this movement faced intense geography wars. In many cities, the proposal to rename a street sparked bitter debates in city halls. Opponents often cited the cost to businesses or the loss of history, but the subtext was often a refusal to acknowledge the shifting racial power dynamics. Consequently, MLK streets were frequently relegated to the most impoverished sections of a city, the inner city, rather than the affluent downtowns. This created a new kind of stigma mapping, where the name of a hero became, in the eyes of some, a marker of a dangerous neighborhood.
Despite these challenges, the 1970s and 80s saw a boom in commemorative naming. Groups representing various ethnic backgrounds began to lobby for their own heroes on the map. In New York, parts of 6th Avenue became Avenue of the Americas to reflect Pan-American unity. In Chicago and Los Angeles, streets were renamed for Cesar Chavez or Rosa Parks. This era proved that street names could serve as a vertical museum, a way for a city to teach its history to every person who drove through it. But this trend also introduced a new complexity to navigation. In some cities, streets ended up with honorary names that existed alongside their official ones. You might be driving on 7th Street, but a smaller sign above it says Muhammad Ali Way. This dual naming was a compromise between the rigid needs of the post office and the emotional needs of the community. As we moved toward the end of the 20th century, the American street map had become a patchwork of different eras: the colonial trees, the numbered grids of the industrial age, the marketing fantasies of the suburbs, and the political monuments of the civil rights era. But just as the map was becoming a rich tapestry of human history, a new force was emerging that would make the physical signs on the corner almost irrelevant: the digital revolution.
As the 21st century dawned, the physical street sign, the metal plate bolted to a pole that had guided humanity for centuries, began to lose its throne. The digital revolution, spearheaded by the advent of GPS, Global Positioning System, and later Google Maps, fundamentally altered how we interact with the names of our streets. In this era, the map migrated from the street corner to the palm of our hand, and in doing so, the names themselves began to undergo a strange transformation. They became data points. For the average driver in the 2000s, the importance of knowing that Elm Street turned into Main Street at the county line started to fade. The voice in the dashboard or the phone began to take over the role of the navigator. We stopped looking up at signs and started looking down at screens. This shift created a phenomenon known as digital tunnel vision. When the algorithm tells you to turn left in 200 feet, the actual name of the street becomes secondary to the blue line on the screen. The historical or social significance of a name, whether it was a civil rights hero or a colonial tree, was reduced to a string of text in a database. However, the transition to a digital map wasn't seamless. It revealed a massive naming debt that had been building up for decades. In many rural parts of America, roads had multiple names, or no names at all, or names that existed only in local folklore. When companies like Google and Navtech began to digitize the world, they had to reconcile these local quirks with the rigid requirements of an algorithm. This led to a massive invisible wave of data cleaning. If a road name was too long for a digital display or had non-standard characters, it was often truncated or standardized. The invisible map began to prioritize computer logic over local history. This era also introduced the shadow name. In the digital world, points of interest, or POIs, often become more important than the streets themselves. People began to navigate not by saying, "I'm on 5th and Broadway," but by saying, "I'm at the Starbucks." The commercial brand started to function as a landmark, much like the Baker Street of the medieval era, but owned by a global corporation. Yet, even as the digital world threatened to make street names irrelevant, it also gave them a new kind of immortality. An error in a digital map could lead hundreds of cars down a quiet residential dead end because the algorithm thought it was a shortcut. These algorithmic glitches showed that even if we aren't looking at the signs, the names and the logic behind them still control our physical movement. The street name had evolved from a wayfinding tool into a piece of code that governs the flow of the modern world. But as the world became more digitized, another trend was brewing in the real world. While the digital map was making names feel like data, a new generation of urban planners was looking back at the past, trying to figure out how to use street names to fix the mistakes of the 20th century.
The new urbanism was about to bring the naming story full circle.
By the 2010s, a movement known as New Urbanism began to take hold across the United States. Urban planners and architects started to look at the sprawling, car-centric suburbs and the sterile, numbered grids of the past with a critical eye.